Morning, everyone. Thanks for dialing in. And certainly thanks for many of you who have taken the time out to jump online today to join what's our public forum in relation to the latest Close the Gap information repository. My name's Selwyn Button. I'm a Goongaroo man from Western Queensland, based in Brisbane, in Meanjin, and I'll be one of the presenters today. My three other colleagues that are on the screen will also be chiming in at different pieces. I've got Nat Siegel-Brown, my fellow commissioner, Andrew McDonald, and Amanda Merrick, who will be going through some of the data for us in the repository today as well. Before we kick off, what I wanted to do is to firstly start by, acknowledging country that we're all located around the place today. And I'm in Brisbane, in Meanjin, on the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people, and acknowledge their ancestry and connection to this country for thousands of years. And so to acknowledge the country where everyone else is located around the place. And I hope everyone's having a nice day, and particularly the guys in Perth that have dialed in for an early start as well. So thanks to those guys. So the outline of the presentation today, I guess what we'll start with is talks through the Commission's role in the sense of what's our role in the overall Close the Gap National Agreement, some developments that have occurred in relation to the latest Annual Data Compilation Report and the dashboard, some of the key messages that are coming out, and certainly relevance to the Close the Gap review that was completed and published in February earlier this year. And just a quick snapshot of how all these things are connected. Certainly the public accountability piece for the Productivity Commission is our role in undertaking the 3 yearly reviews of performance against the Close the Gap National Agreement. And so whilst we're doing the 3-year reviews, which is the one that was published in February earlier this year, we also do the Annual Data Compilation Reports, and this is what we'll talk about today. And in addition to that, we have the responsibility to maintain the dashboard. So it's making sure that when we're doing the reviews, the data is still relevant, and making sure that people get that out and can track and see performance and what that looks like against the 19 indicators, and then certainly looks at what we're doing to ensure that the dashboard is up to date and gives people some relevant information that you can go to and use in the work that's going on around the place as well. Some of the pieces that are yet to start, as you'll see on the screen, there is an Arbitrage Islander-led review, which is yet to commence, and that will certainly be something that we'll do. There'll be a complementary piece for the Productivity Commission's review to ensure that there's the views of Arbitrage Islander people that are part of the process, and it's then focusing on ensuring that we can see the complementary pieces between government review as well as community control review. So if we go to the next slide, thanks, Andrew. So some of the developments that you'll see in the 2024 ADCR, we've actually included some historical and ongoing contextual information, recognised contributions and resilience of Arbitrage Islander people. It's now written and developed in a thematic approach to reporting the outcomes, showing the interconnectedness between the outcomes, and we've given a clearer picture of data availability and gaps, noting that there are still some pieces of the puzzle that are missing around gaps, and there's some work that's happening at Joint Council, and certainly in the conversations that have been going on through the Partnership Working Group to focus on those data gaps. That what we're reporting on now is where we're at, but noting that there's still some pieces that are missing throughout the process that's being worked on in the background between the Coalition of Peaks and NIAA and other parties to the agreement as well. So some of the developments in the July dashboard update as well. So if we look at where we're at and what you'll see online, and we'll certainly take you through with a live update and a bit of a deep dive into some of these that Amanda and Andrew will walk us through a little bit later. The dashboard contains the context for 8 socioeconomic targets. We've got life expectancy, healthy babies, early childhood education, adult incarceration, youth justice, child protection. And so what we've done more specifically in that is to provide some contextualized information that sits inside the dashboard itself as well. So showing exactly what are some of those things and how do those things contribute more broadly, and the interconnectedness between the two. And what we've done certainly across the board in the report, as well as what you see in the dashboard online, is taken more of a holistic view, and certainly lent on the work of Pat Dudgeon and others in looking at what is holistic wellbeing for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, and how do we then look at theming those things on the dashboard in the report to ensure that we can see the interconnectedness between those things as well. And we've also got some new artwork that you'll see on the report, and certainly you'll see in the background behind the presenters today. And it's the artist that was engaged by the Productivity Commission is Alani Balzan, and certainly the work that she produced for the Commission is showing some pathways to progress. And as you'll see, there are 3 pieces that we've used, and certainly what the expectation is that we'll look at theming those over the next 3 years to show progress. You can learn a little bit more about Lani's artwork, but certainly we'll be using that for consistency and messaging and consistency of branding for the report, certainly over the next 3 years. Now, there's been some progress in setbacks, and certainly of the 15 socioeconomic targets and the data available to assess those things, what we're seeing at the moment is that we do have 5 targets that are showing good improvement and certainly on track. We have 5 targets that are showing small improvement but are not on track. 1 target that's no change from the baseline, 4 targets that are worsening, and 4 targets that still cannot be assessed because we still haven't landed, I guess, the data definitions, and certainly what some agreed consistency around collecting those sorts of things. So what we'll now do is, and I'll hand over to my colleague Nat to walk us through the next few slides, is to then do a bit of a deep dive into some of those targets so you get a bit of an idea of what that looks like. So thanks, Nat.
Thanks, Sel, and hello, everybody. I too am coming from the lands of the Yagara Turrbal people, and I'd like to honour connection to country and land and community and identity on the country that I'm on, and to all the countries that you're coming to today. I saw in the chat function, or should I say the Q&A function, that a number of you have asked whether the presentation will be available after this session, and the answer is yes, absolutely. We can make this slide pack available to you. There will also be a recorded version of this webinar online that you can access at any time. So yes, the answer is today is indeed being recorded. The next 2 slides really capture the major outcome areas under which we've themed the data. And Sel's given you a bit of an overall picture. I'm just going to detail that overall picture a little bit more. So Sel mentioned that 5 of the targets show good improvement and are on track. So they relate to healthy birth weight, preschool enrolment, land subject to Indigenous rights and interests, sea area subject to Indigenous rights and interests, and employment. There are 5 targets that show improvement since the first year we measured them, but they are simply not on track to reach their destination or the aspired goal by 2031. And they are life expectancy, attainment of year 12, tertiary education, youth employment, and appropriate housing. So lack of overcrowding is a big part of that. There's 1 target that's had no change since the baseline year. Now, what I want to say about that is we've actually had 2 targets that have improved since last year. But the reason we aren't reporting that as moving from 4 targets on track to 6 targets on track is because one of the targets from last year has gone back to being as bad as it was right at the baseline when governments undertook to improve it. And that is the children and young people overrepresented in youth detention. And we can talk a bit more about that later. 4 of the targets are worsening, and they relate to the rate of suicide, children developmentally on track, children who've been removed from their family in child protection systems, and adults who are imprisoned. And again, I'll speak to these issues a little bit more. As Sel also mentioned, there are 4 that simply cannot be assessed, and that is relating to the prevalence and incidence of family violence, people receiving basic essential services, the number of Aboriginal languages spoken, and digital inclusion. And that's literally because there is no data available to show progress, or we literally haven't received any of the data since the first time they were measured. So there is some improvement across all of the socioeconomic areas of disadvantage, but people will rightly ask whether it's enough. So what I'll do now is I'm going to jump into the detail of each of these. So if I can ask you, Andrew, to jump back to that slide with the detailed outcome areas. The first one, obviously, is very positive news. The target for babies of a healthy birth weight is on track to be met by 2031. However, the life expectancy gap between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous people is not on track to close by 2031. So just a qualification on this one. This is one of the targets we can only update every 5 years. So we're only going to be able to update that once more prior to reaching the end of the target period. As you would have heard when I just spoke, tragically, the rate of suicide among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has increased since the baseline year. And the most recent data is showing that suicide is still the leading cause of death for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aged 15 to 39. That was the statistic that was acquired from 2022, which is our most recent data set. And I want to pause on that statistic because what that means is that in 2022, 212 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across New South Wales, Queensland, WA, South Australia and the Northern Territory, which are the only jurisdictions for which we acquire data, took their own lives. The rate of suicide is hard enough to hear, let alone that it's actually increased from 174 people to 212 people. So I can understand that that is a really hard statistic to hear, and there are such critical, important human beings to our society behind each of those numbers. The next section, families and kids, shows us the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people in the child protection system, as well as the issues relating to family violence. And this is where we're continuing to see persistent overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in the child protection system. And I can imagine that a number of you are already making a link between the statistics and the lack of progress around government interventions with or lack of interventions, should I say, in some of these areas, and how that impacts some of the other statistics around taking of one's life, around family safety. So education and training is one area where we are continuing to see more positive signs across the board. The only target that we update in the Annual Data Compilation Report is target 3. So that's enrolment before full-time schooling and early childhood education. And there's definitely been an increase in this since we last reported the data. As we make very clear within the report itself, obviously enrolment cannot be interpreted as an indicator of engagement or attendance. These are things that we are still looking at the moment. The target is simply the enrolment. You might be wondering why this statistic appears to be over 100%. And this is because the administrative data we receive on enrolments and the estimated population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children don't quite match. And that's likely because the count for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population of children and young people is an undercount. So that's going to be rectified by the ABS in our next report. I might just get you to jump to the next slide, please, Andrew. Thank you. So I'm going to let you just have a look here at the remaining themes. Obviously, there's a lot, but there are two areas I want to draw your attention to specifically. The justice theme captures adult incarceration and youth justice, being targets 10 and 11. Here, things are worsening almost consistently across the board. So remembering, we're only really reporting targets at a national level because that's what the agreement requires. But different things can happen at jurisdictional levels that sometimes mean that one jurisdiction is compensating for a lack of progress or even a regression in another jurisdiction. Both of these issues are pretty much consistently worse across the board in every jurisdiction. So the number of adults in prison is continuing to grow rather than decline. And the figure you see here is an increase from both the previous year This is relating to overrepresentation as well as the baseline year. So the years in which the statistics were such that we committed to change. So this tells you how far we're regressing from the target, which actually seeks a regression of 15%, or I should say a reduction by 15% by 2031. So we're also reporting an increase in the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people in detention. And this latest data, as I mentioned earlier, means the target is no longer on track. It means that there's been no change in overrepresentation since the baseline year of 2018-19. So, as I mentioned, last period, there was an improvement last year, but now we've gone backwards. And finally, we are seeing positive outcomes in relation to targets 15A and 15B, which is the relationship of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around interests and rights to land and waters. So for the first time, sea country subject to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights and interests is on track to be met, as well as the land subject to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights and interests. The next slide, Andrew, if you wouldn't mind, relates to states and territories. So this is the performance at the jurisdictional level. So we talked about the fact just before that the targets get reported at a national level only because that's what the agreement requires, but it is really important that we dive down into the jurisdictional level. And as we mentioned in our 3-yearly review, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people know that even the jurisdictional statistics can mask what's going on at the regional and community level. So as you can see from this chart, and you can have a good look at this in the report that's just been released, or even in the slide pack when we send it, the picture looks very different at the jurisdictional level. So our assessments of state and territory progress is currently limited simply to whether outcomes have improved, worsened, or remained unchanged. Ideally, you could take this a lot further to actually see the relative statistical performance. And as some of you know, as I mentioned before, there's calls to do that at the lowest aggregate level. And we are continuing to have conversations about how we can start to disaggregate this data, just as the agreement itself commits governments to doing. So this particular figure here, you'll find this in an appendix to the report. What you will see positively is that in the majority of states, we are seeing improvements in outcomes for most targets. In the Northern Territory, we're only seeing improvement for about half. But that said, it's the justice and the child protection targets where we are seeing the most worsening across the board. Andrew, if I can get you to move to the next slide, please. So, as we've also said previously, there is the tyranny of the aggregate means that we often miss some of the really important detail. And these aggregate headline results for the targets, they really are only part of the story. Progress, as I mentioned, is always reported nationally. And what it doesn't pick up is the different experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in different regions and within specific communities. And we know the local experience can look diametrically different to the national and even state or territory level experience. So what we've tried to do here is actually disaggregate the data to provide more insights into some of the outcomes and experiences in different population groups, highlighting areas of progress and where greater effort is needed, but that's still not giving us that regional or community breakdown. So the ones on your screen are the cohorts, if you like, not the most pleasant of words, for which we have been able to disaggregate some results. Thank you, Andrew. Next slide, please. So we have the target indicators, or the targets which we report on at the macro level, and underneath that we have some supporting indicators. So for example, we have particular data sets that we report on which go to establish whether the target is being met. Now these supporting indicators, which are sort of the next level down, they provide more informed picture of the elements that contribute to the progress against the targets. And as you can see in this slide, we have 10 new ones that we've reported against, really important ones in this current Annual Data Compilation Report. And those supporting indicators are really important for us to report on in two really important ways, because they measure the factors that significantly impact progress against the target, but they also give us really important contextual information, the insights into the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people underneath that big headline outcome. And they also are useful because we can receive data on those indicators much more frequently than we might be able to acquire for the headline targets overall. And so that really helps us to understand progress where we haven't got more regular availability of data. But even with those supporting indicators, still doesn't give us the whole picture. So it's great to have these new 10 indicators, but we are still not getting, you know, the full picture about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lives and experiences. And that is why, obviously, we make the differentiation between this being a statistical data report, one that doesn't necessarily have all the supporting indicators that we could acquire to get that full picture. So you can see here that we currently only report on 31 out of the 164 supporting indicators that have been discussed as important to giving us a much fuller picture. So the data outlined in this report and even our dashboard, it's only a portion of those outlined in the agreement itself. We are working very hard with parties to the agreement to develop the supporting indicators, expand the range of indicators that are reported on each year. And that will require a lot of effort on both sides, including jurisdictions making that data available. So there's additional work underway at the moment with government and the community to progress those 150 data development items as well that are outlined in the Closing the Gap data development plan that still aren't finalised. So I'm just going to move to the next slide to just talk about some other gaps that need to be addressed in understanding just even the data landscape. So Andrew, if I can get you to move ahead. Unfortunately, even now, it's still not possible to assess progress for every target. And a big piece of this is because the data is simply not available with the frequency that one would hope. So on this slide, you can see the frequency with which each of the targets are reported against. And as just an example, if you look under the 5-yearly reporting, life expectancy, education, youth engagement, these really big things, we're only acquiring data every 5 years, and it's often quite retrospective. So I mentioned to you earlier some of the data as being the most recent data, but it's 2022 data. So there's issues with the frequency, but there's also issues with the quality and the availability of data and the gaps in what type of data is provided. And importantly, since the Annual Data Compilation Report was published the first time, which was in 2021, progress has not been assessed for 4 of the targets, 4 of the 19 targets. And updates to progress for 7 of the targets have only occurred once. So there are 4 targets for which we simply do not have the data to assess progress against. They are big, and I mentioned those earlier on, and they include things like family violence. The reason for that is because an appropriate data source hasn't yet been identified, or the survey intervals haven't been updated since the baseline year, or we simply don't know when or if the data will be available again. And importantly, as many of you will be familiar with from the 3-yearly review, which we just did, where we really focused heavily on the priority reforms because there was no data available at the time, we are still waiting for data sources to be developed to report on the priority reforms. So Andrew, I might just get you to move ahead to that one before the exciting bit starts, which is where I pop off and you take us for a test drive so people can see exactly how they can access the data and disaggregate it for themselves as much as possible. So there is still no measurement of the priority reforms in either the Annual Data Compilation Report or the dashboard. And as many of you will know, these 4 priority reforms were really considered to be the levers against which, if government achieved those reforms, we should see a big step change in the target areas under the agreement. And obviously we made a lot of comment about that within our 3-yearly review. Really pleased to see that Joint Council, which is all the jurisdictions, have announced that they've accepted 15 out of the 16 recommendations we made in that review. Some of you may be aware that a couple of those relate distinctly to the wording of the priority reforms. So the first one was around sharing power, and certainly updating that priority reform 1 to be related to self-determination, and also adapting priority reform 4 to capture Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance. That said, they are only the recommendations relating to changing the text of those priority reforms. There are a lot of actions we recommended that need to take place to actually cause implementation and move us out of this static business as usual area that we seem to be operating in at the moment. We understand there is some work progressing on the priority reform data areas, and that a measurement framework and recommended indicators have been developed in draft and they've been submitted to NIAA. But I think it's also worth flagging here that we made a lot of comment in the 3-yearly review about the independent mechanism, which originally was designed to assess progress and hold governments accountable for priority reform 3. Governments have now accepted that the independent mechanism should actually be used to hold governments accountable against all 4 of the priority reforms. So that will be a really critical source of data and information and qualitative input into how governments are performing against each of those 4 priority reforms. And we were very pleased to see governments accepting the comments we made as to the scope and punch that independent mechanism would need to have. Now for the good bit. Not that the other bits weren't good, because there's obviously some great bits of progress in there too. But Andrew, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through what it's like to access the data and how people can use it and interpret it themselves and break it down. So over to you.
Thanks. Before I start, Natalie, I think, Selwyn, you just wanted to perhaps respond to a couple of the questions that have come through.
Yeah, so there are questions coming through, and thanks very much for the questions that are coming through. I wanted to just jump in, and I will make sure that the majority of the questions that we can answer through the data presentation are included. What we are doing is some of these questions can be responded to by Andrew as we're going through the process now of looking at things, but certainly wanted to make sure at least that for those people who are putting questions in, we will make sure that we can get to those, and they'll be included in the conversations that'll happen now as we're doing the data presentation. And if not, we'll, as I said, we'll come back at the end to make sure we cover them off as well. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Selwyn, and good morning, everyone. And I'd like to acknowledge that I am on Bunurong country and beautiful lands to the south of Melbourne. And I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the land and the leaders past, present and emerging. Thank you. Now I'll just navigate out of the slide pack onto our website so people can see the dashboard. So if I just come on here, so when you arrive on the dashboard, you'll get the landing page here, which can take you through to assessment pages for the priority reforms and the annual data, and the target or socioeconomic outcome areas. Before I go into those, there is also the Annual Data Compilation Report. It's a fabulous report that really helps explain some of the logic within the agreement and how the data fits together, and provides some of that written context, much easier to read and understand the data. But for a visual tour, the dashboard is perhaps a bit easier, so it will flow through to there. There was a question about some of the shorthand which we'd include in the slides, like what do we mean by SEO1? SEO1 is the socioeconomic outcome area 1, long and healthy lives. I think the other question was 11, which is around youth justice. So my apologies for using shorthand in the slides like that, but that's what those refer to. There was, before I go on, there was a question about the suicide data and whether data, in particular for Victoria, should be available. The ABS has worked with the jurisdictions to determine which data sets have sufficient data quality checks to ensure it's suitable for use in the national data sets. Up until now, they've not used the Victorian data, but we understand that there are discussions going on between the ABS and Victorian government. We're hopeful that soon the Victorian data at least will be included in that data, but we'll wait for that to come through from the ABS and Victorian government. We wanted to just demonstrate how the data are presented on a couple of slides. I might go to Amanda to talk a little bit about socioeconomic outcome area number 2. Amanda.
Thanks, Andrew. I just wanted to say that I'm a Turrbal woman and I am grateful and privileged to work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And now we'll head into the dashboard. So socioeconomic outcome area 2 is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are born healthy and strong. That's the area that we're looking for. And the target to get to that outcome that we have listed is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are born healthy and strong. And the target is that by 2031, increase the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander babies with a healthy birth weight to 91%. So you can see that we measured the baseline for this target using 2017 data and that we update the progress annually. The latest year for our progress of assessment is 2021. And of the 18,539 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children born that year, 89.6% were of a healthy birth weight. And this is up from 88.8 in 2017, which is the base year. As you can see here, the target is on track to be met. In addition to the target information, though, there are also supporting indicators that provide context to the drivers of the outcomes. And these supporting indicators, as you can see on the left, are smoking during pregnancy and the use of antenatal care. As Sal mentioned earlier, there is also additional historical and ongoing contexts. The additional contexts help improve cultural safety and help improve a comprehensive understanding of the data itself. The contexts are strength-based. They prioritise literature and research by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander authors and centre Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. We believe that the contexts provide a valuable addition to the dashboard and the ADCR. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Amanda. And just to address one of the queries as well about whether or not we have the state and territory assessments on the dashboard. Yes, we do. We come in, we show the national results and provide a brief summary of the national results. We also show the assessment against the state and territory below the figure. And you can adjust these main target pages to show what's happening for an individual jurisdiction. And the assessment for state and territory, as we've discussed, is purely whether this orange line, which is the trend from the baseline year, is improving, flat, no change, or worsening. And it'll depend on the target whether an increase is an improvement or a worsening. And in case in point, if I move to outcome 11, sorry, I'm double checking myself, outcome 11, we can see the outcome area for Aboriginal young people not overrepresented in the criminal justice system, where the target is to reduce the rate of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people in detention by at least 30%. You can see since the baseline year, which was 2018-19, there was an initial decrease and improvement in the rate, more recent increases. So overall, this trend line is flat, and hence our assessment that there's been no change from the baseline. As we've discussed, it's important to have a look at what's driving these changes. And so we have a supporting indicator on children 10 to 13 years first coming into contact with the justice system. This indicator goes through 4 measures. One on when they first enter youth detention, where they 10 to 13 years of age, with their age when they first entered youth supervision. So this includes community supervision as well as youth detention. What the age or what proportion of children are aged 10 to 13 that first appear in criminal courts, or their first interactions with the police and police proceedings. We've got another supporting indicator here on young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's interaction with police when they're first proceeded against by police, how many times they might be proceeded against by police, once, twice, or 3 or more times, and whether or not proceedings lead to a court proceeding or a non-court action. I just wanted to mention before I go back to Nat, the other thing that you can see, as always, we talked about the importance of disaggregations, that the aggregate hides many stories. For each of the targets, we report the disaggregations, might be by sex, by age group. You can flick through the results by Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, non-Indigenous, see what's happening in particular states. That I might hand back to Natalie to continue the presentation.
Thanks, Andrew. And I can see there's some really, the questions are streaming in. They're awesome questions. Thank you. Some of them are quite specifically data related. So I'll get Andrew to answer some of those specific questions. I can see a couple of people are asking about out-of-home care stats and whether placement with a relative is considered out-of-home care. Yes, kin care, if formally registered, is considered a form of out-of-home care. So the 3 types that we broadly refer to are kin care, foster care, and residential care. And sadly, residential care is also vastly overrepresented. Somebody asked whether the birthweight stats were as against the non-Indigenous population. What you'll see across a lot of the data reporting areas is that the targets are not necessarily all positioned against how they appear as against non-Indigenous people. They really are about, expectable outcomes and aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the healthy birth weight statistic of 91% is just for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. That said, when you go into some of the areas in the dashboard, and Andrew, I think you may have touched on this, what we have done is we've got a separate tab for non-Indigenous people that you can click on so that you can actually see what the rates are currently for non-Indigenous people as well. I also can see that people are really interested in the disaggregation by geographic location. As agreement between the parties comes together on reporting this data, how it will be done, which is part of the data development agreement or plan, we will absolutely be reporting on that data. But when I finish off, and I promise I will be as quick as I possibly can to make as much time for our questions as we can, I might get Andrew to dump into things like, for example, why there's no youth justice data for Victoria. So you can see, and you'll notice this when you guys have a play through the dashboard, you'll jump in, and when you break it down by jurisdiction, there'll be some jurisdictions which don't have any data. We are working as hard as we can with the parties to rectify this. It is an ongoing issue, and as soon as it comes to hand, we will be publishing it. So the last thing I just wanted to point out, and Andrew, if you don't mind flicking through to the very last slide before we move to questions. And this really relates, this also squarely responds, hopefully, to a question that a couple of people have asked around what is the theory of change around how we are going to change these outcomes? What's the logic? What is the roadmap for change? And that really dives straight into the guts of our 3-yearly review. Because what we found was that there are a lot of implementation plans by jurisdictions that sometimes contain up to 70% existing actions. There is no theory of change outlining exactly how governments have thought deeply about where they are today to where they need to be. Now, to a degree, the priority reforms, the 4 priority reforms, represent huge change processes in and of themselves that will be vital to changing the outcomes. And one of the things we found in our review was that where the 4 priority reforms were in action, where government behaviour against the 4 priority reforms, and the 4 priority reforms are all about government behaviour, where they were in place locally, and it wasn't systemically, in the isolated pockets where we found them in place, we saw targets being exceeded, and often exceeded in a way that outperformed outcomes for non-Indigenous communities. And interestingly, the one that I personally observe to have been the most fundamental to change is that first one around shared decision-making. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led scoping of the issue, defining of the problem, right through to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led solution and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander designed indicators for success. So our entire report was based around the things that governments need to do to actually move away from that business as usual approach and start modelling that roadmap for change. We were really rapt that 15 out of the 16 actions that we recommended from our 4 major recommendations. So on your screen right now, you can see our 4 headline recommendations, roughly 4 actions under each. 15 out of those 16 actions have been accepted, and we are really looking forward to seeing how quickly they are implemented and how thoroughly they are implemented. Somebody's just asked a question around whether PWG should be responsible for theory of change, and I think absolutely we would see that joint government efforts around theory of change is important, but jurisdictions themselves need to arrive at theories of change across their government, and each agency needs to do it as well. I am going to pause there. It only leaves us about 10 minutes for questions. Thank you for engaging so deeply. I will try my absolute hardest to get to all of them, but what I would say to you is that we could try and get back to you individually if you have any questions that I have missed. Even if you want us to come and speak to your organisation or group, we can try and answer some very specific questions. But in the main, we've observed there's some questions oriented around some themes. So I think we've probably got about 30 or 40 questions from what I can tell. So I'll try and kind of link into the themes of those questions rather than addressing individual questions per se, if that's okay, just to try and get through it. But feel free to email us anything specifically. We're more than keen to help, and we're rapt to keep the conversation going. So As I mentioned, there's been a number of questions around what are states and territories doing to address the data gaps? What's the role of the Productivity Commission in engaging with states and territories to address those data gaps? We are working hard with our counterparts, or we're working hard with the parties to the agreement continually to make sure that we can keep increasing the number of supporting indicators that are delivered. Ultimately, there's a bunch of intra-governmental decisions that are made around reporting of data, but the reporting of that data is an obligation under the agreement. So we are constantly trying to push for these things to be reported. And of course, we know that, we're never getting the full picture, and we get a skewed approach if we're only getting some jurisdictions reporting on things and not others. The link between government action and an improvement in the targets, that's something that people are also asking about. That is real. If you jump into our volume 1 of our report in February, we delve really deeply into this, because we certainly heard all around the country over the 18 months of our 3-yearly review that those priority reforms are considered by MOB to be the levers for change. And as I mentioned, we are seeing awesome changes, an awesome outcome for communities in the pockets where we see the priority reforms in actions. Gaps are closing, and they're closing fast in those places. Some people have asked about where they can find a disaggregation of data by states and territories. If you jump onto the website, there's the dashboard area. That should give you some of that disaggregation. People have been asking really important questions about the connection between some of the SEOs, being children in out-of-home care, family violence, incarceration rates. Undoubtedly, huge links with those. And what we've done this time around, which we haven't done previously, is to, and maybe I think, Andrew, did we want to take down the slide pack from here and just move to kind of open questions? What we've tried to do within the report itself is actually talk about what those links look like. And we've really tried as hard as we can to centre Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, not our own internal belly-gazed perspectives on what those linkages are. But I think we're hoping that some of these linkages and data will also help you make the case where you are for things that need to change. We obviously have not been backward in coming forward in our recent review about the fact that a number of states and territories have actively contravened commitments around reducing over-incarceration, for example, in youth detention, by enacting policies and legislative changes which only serves to increase those numbers, when we know a lot of the issues also lie within the child protection system, the lack of application of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. You'll find a lot of this both within the context section of our ADCR as well as in the report itself. So I guess that really gets to some of the questions about whether we feel as a commission the priority reforms will lead to change. We are hopeful that some of the measurement items will come forward soon for those priority reforms. I think it would be fair to say that we think priority reforms aren't something that can be solely measured by quantitative data, that we need to reflect the experience on the ground. One of the things we said in our report around the independent mechanism is that it actually needs to have a function that takes complaints in real time from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about government behaviour, that it needs to have even a hearings function to be able to inquire into these things, because all of that provides context around the experience of whether priority reforms are in action, and often that will have a very distinct deliverable or impact on the socioeconomic outcome areas. There was also some questions around specific links between health risk factor data and smoking during pregnancy. Andrew, are you able to talk about whether that data comes from the AIHW? There's another question here about whether there are offence trends for the increasing incarceration rates. Are they a couple of questions you might be able to speak to?
I can speak briefly to those. Yeah, so the birthweight data does come from the publication that AIHW prepare. It's the National Perinatal Data Collection beneath that. What I will say is on every page we report, there is something called the target data specifications or the indicator data specifications, and they always provide you a link to the original data source. So if we talk about the offence classifications as well, we don't have those on the dashboard, but I'm sure they're available in the ABS data if you wanted to dig deeper on that specific one. And there was also a question about regional information, and while we don't always have all the detail on the dashboard for the regional information that we'd like to have, we have provided some links, and in particular to the AHW regional information for Indigenous communities. They have broken a number of the closing the gap targets down to regional areas. There's also the ABS data by region, which all does something similar. So where we can't provide everything on the dashboard, we are trying to at least give people the opportunity to do a bit further digging through the links we provide.
Andrew, there's another question here about whether there's any data for cultural health indicators. A really great question, and obviously one that has a huge impact on the targets and the outcomes. Do you know if that's on the plan for supporting indicators or data development?
So, sorry, I'm just flicking through to the page. We're very much guided or directed by what's in the national agreement. So that's set out with the Coalition of Peaks and the governments to determine what they want to have reported on the dashboard. And I need to double check. I don't believe that specifically is planned for the dashboard, at least in the short term, but it's something that we can keep in mind, and further discussions with the parties, if that comes on board, would be looking at that as well.
Right. I'm going to try and answer a couple of more questions quickly, but I will just let you know if you want to shoot through any further questions to us, the email address is ctg, as in closing the gap, .data@pc.gov.au. So that's ctg.data@pc.gov.au. There was a question about whether we are considering hospitalisation data to support the family violence indicators. The answer to that is yes. If you jump into the dashboard or the ADCR, you will find that hospitalisation data is there, but it's really important to remember, of course, that hospitalisation data is not a measurement of family violence, and that's important for a couple of reasons. As we know, family violence extends well beyond physical violence. It doesn't cover emotional abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse, all the other known factors. Even reporting data can be very vexed, police reporting data, because we know that an increase in police reports can either mean that there is an increased trust level in reporting, or it could mean increased prevalence. Generally speaking, it has been the self-reported data that has been taken as the most reliable of prevalence and incidence of family violence. And that's certainly been the case with things like the ABS's personal safety survey, etc. However, unfortunately, there's been some real issues with the data collection for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in terms of using culturally safe methods and for self-reported data. And of course, that requires a lot of trust as well. So I guess that's why we wouldn't suggest that the hospitalisation data should be taken as indicative of prevalence and incidence. But it is there if you are looking for it and you jump into the website. A number of people asking about whether we'll be comparing not just data by jurisdiction, but against regional versus urban, hinterland versus other areas. At the moment, what you will see there is we've got some disaggregation between remote and not remote, but we haven't been able to acquire sufficient data to break it down much more than that. And again, it is a commitment within the agreement. Parties have signed up to disaggregating the data a lot more than just at the jurisdictional level. And that is something that is still very much a work in progress for us with the parties. Sel, Amanda, Andrew, I have done my best, but I may have missed some things. Is there anything you wanted to jump in and answer in our last minute or two from the brilliant questions that we've received?
There was a question about whether and when we might be measuring the priority reforms. And I think we can say that we know the governments and the Coalition of Peaks are doing work to progress that. So we are hopeful that we may get some guidance over the next 12 months, and we may see some reporting on that in the not too distant future.
Thank you. Jess Sariego, I can see you've got your hand up. Was that a mistake, maybe? Sel, Amanda, before I close out the presentation, anything you wanted to add?
Not the only thing to add, Nat, and I think there was a question in relation to the priority reforms, and are the priority reforms still, I guess, the underlying basis for the implementation of the Close the Gap National Agreement? And the answer to that question would be yes, because where we have seen success and where we're seeing significant improvement and some of the outcomes as we've talked about, it's also been as a result of the implementation of those priority reforms, where there is co-design, there's funding that's attached. Government are actually handing over power for decisions to be made by community control organisations. Data is being shared. Where all those elements are happening and are occurring, we can certainly see pockets of success and significant improvement. So that's why it's still important to focus back on where the priority reforms and how we measure those. And as Andrew alluded to, there's conversations happening at PWG and other places at the moment where they're having conversations about how best to measure the priority reform implementation over time as well.
And I might just poach this one last minute for those who can stay online. There was a question about whether the Closing the Gap Commonwealth Partnership Stocktake conducted by the NIAA feeds into this data. Does the stocktake feed into this data? Andrew, can I hand that question to you as our last question?
To be honest, I'm going to refer back to that early slide that you Sel presented on the infrastructure around the reporting, where we provide some of the baseline data and the 3 really review for the Closing the Gap, but then jurisdictions are responding to that, doing their own annual data compilation or their own annual reports and their implementation plans. And I think the partnership stocktake feeds into that side of it. So it circles back around, but I wouldn't say that that's the direct link between the partnership stocktake and the data that we're reporting, but it's part of the infrastructure, so it does feed back in through that.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, everybody, for your attention on a Monday morning. We really appreciate it. And thank you to colleagues in WA who started a bit early to jump in online as well. Please stay engaged. We're really happy to keep talking to anyone. So if you just want to email that address again that I mentioned, which is ctg.data@pc.gov.au, feel free to ask us to come and have a chat to you if you like as well. We're always really happy to keep talking, and we look forward to engaging with you all further through our continued work in this area.
Thanks, guys. Yeah.